A woman in a nightgown. I've been a person who was never sure what to believe in relation to ghosts, but my experience has boggled my mind. I was around 12 or so, and my cousin, brother, and I were all hanging out in our family room, watching movies. It was like midnight, and my mom had been in bed for a few hours. I looked up and saw, at least what I thought was my mom, walk past the entryway to the family room from the living room to the kitchen. My brother even called out, "Hey mom," no response. She just walked right past, without acknowledging us, and into the kitchen and far out of view. She was wearing a long, flowing, whitish nightgown. Keep in mind the entire house was pitch black except for the light of the TV. A couple seconds later, we were wondering what was going on, so we got up and glanced in the kitchen. Nothing, just darkness. We started freaking out, and all three of us ran down the hallway, through the living room, and burst into her room. She was lying in bed, passed out asleep. We woke her up and asked if she had just been in the kitchen. She leaned up to not figure out what was happening, and she was wearing blue pajamas, not wearing a white nightgown. We freaked out. I didn't know what to think. There's a door that connects the kitchen to a room, but that door was always wedged shut. It would make a loud, creaking, scraping noise once it was shoved open. No one ever used that door. We were up and heading towards her room in a matter of seconds. She wouldn't have had time to walk past, shove open and close the door, and change her clothes. We had no idea who or what we saw walk past that kitchen that night. I would have convinced myself I was seeing things, but my brother called her name too. He saw it as well. I'm not making this up. It's been over 10 years, and I'm now 24 years old. The thought still gives me weird goosebumps, and for some reason I start to tear up when I think about it too much. I'm an intelligent and rational person, but if you ask me if I believe in ghosts, I cannot comfortably say no. Elevator buttons. When I was a child, my parents lived in an old apartment building that was 14 stories high. Like many buildings, it was built without a 13th floor. It went straight from the 12th floor to the 14th floor. However, the elevator still had a 13th button, even though it didn't work. There were two other kids, Terry and June, who were living in the building. We were the same age. We went to the same school, and there was three of us that often played together in the evenings. One day, while we were waiting for our parents to come home, we decided to explore the roof of the apartment building. We took to the elevator to the 14th floor, where we found the door to the access and then to the roof. After a while, we grew bored and went back downstairs in the elevator. When we were halfway down, Junes realized that she had forgotten something. She left her coat on the roof. She hit the stop button, then pressed the button on the 14th floor. Suddenly, the elevator ground came to a halt and beeped 3 times. The door slid open and we realized we were stuck between the floors. Terry was about to slide out through the opening when I grabbed him and held him back. I told him it was too dangerous. If the elevator started up again while we were trying to get out, we could be sliced in half. Instead, I jabbed at the emergency button. The elevator door groaned again and the door slowly slid shut with a clang. "What's going on?" asked Terry. I shook my head and replied, "I don't know." As we stood there shivering, the lights in the elevator suddenly went off and we were plunged into darkness. Then, one of the buttons of the panel lit up. It was a button for the 13th floor. None of us had pressed that button before. It simply lit up by itself. It wasn't supposed to be able to light up. There was no 13th floor. To our complete and utter horror, we felt the elevator move slowly and move upwards. June jabbed the stop button, but it didn't work. We watched as the floors passed. 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. There was a sound of scraping metal and the elevator ground to a halt. The door slid open and we were staring into pitch black darkness. All three of us huddled together in the elevator, too petrified to move. Just then, we heard a faint noise in the murky blackness. It made our hair stand on the end. Squelch, squelch. It was a wet and sticky noise, the kind of noise you get when you throw a wet cloth against a wall. Squelch, 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 squelch. It sounded like something soggy, dragging itself across the floor. As we strained our ears to listen, trembling in fear, the sound grew faster, gathering pace. Squelch, 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 squelch. There was a sticky, moldy smell in the air. It was like a stench of rotting meat. The sound picked up at pace, getting faster and faster. Squelch, 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 squelch. Just when it sounded like it was almost upon us, the elevator sprang to life. The doors began to close. The stench of the dead and decay was unbearable. As soon as the elevator door shut with a clang, something smashed into them with a wet slap. The elevator creaked and began to go down. When the doors finally opened, we found ourselves on the ground floor. My father was standing there. When I saw him, I jumped up and embraced him. I still wonder what would have happened if he hadn't pressed the button to call the elevator at that exact moment. Demon in the dark. My family traveled to the south of France to stay in a cottage owned by someone my dad worked with. The owners visited occasionally, but that summer was free, and we had 10 days booked in there. After a long 2 days on the road, we drove down a steep driveway towards a secluded mill cottage, with the water wheel sat static alongside the stone house. There was a deep cellar with stone stairs down under the wheel next to the house, and a small river circled the place. We went into the house and chose rooms, but being set down into small cops, the house was draught and cold from lack of use. We settled in and turned all the heating on, yet the house remained cold and felt damp. The first night we had set up a fire in the living room and listened to a couple of audiobooks before my sister and I went to sleep. My parents stayed up a little longer then and went to bed. Around midnight they both woke up at exactly the same time, and the door to their bedroom was opened slowly. At first they thought it was my sister, until they saw a large, dark silhouette of a man framed in the doorway, standing still, just looking in the direction as if it was praising them. After a short period, the shape turned and started to move, as if satisfied, and disappeared. They looked at each other, but didn't speak, and both went back to sleep. The next morning, the house felt warm and dry, and sunlight was back through the windows, as if someone had lifted and accepted them. They spoke the next day and both agreed that although they were skeptics, it could have been anything other than something supernatural in that doorway, deciding their worth. Insularlife building. The Insularlife building in Makati City, the Philippines, is believed to be haunted. They say the ghost is a daughter of one of the previous owners, and she has been seen on the 8th floor. There was a man who worked on the 9th floor of the building. One night, he was working late hours, and it was around 3 a.m. when he finally left his office. He took the elevator down, but it stopped at the 7th floor. As the doors opened, the face of a young woman peered around the corner. "Going up?" she asked. "No, going down," the man responded. The young woman smiled and said, "Thank you." The doors closed as the elevator began to descend. The man wondered why the woman was still in the building at such a late hour. When he got to the lobby, he walked over to the security guard and asked, "Who was that woman on the 7th floor, and why was she working so late?" The security guard looked at the man and said, "There are no offices on the 7th floor. The entire floor is vacant. You must have seen a ghost." The man's jaw dropped. "The ghost?" he asked. "Yes," the security guard replied. "She was a daughter of the building's previous owner. She committed suicide a long time ago by jumping from the 12th floor. It's a sad, sad story. When she hit the 7th floor, she was decapitated, which is why you only see her head when she peers into the elevator." Drain. When I was about 11 or 10, my family lived in a 3-story house. My bedroom was on the top floor. It was small, square, and simple. There was a glass door in my bedroom that led to a small brick room. There was no ceiling on this room, and there was an opening in the roof that extended to open air. There was nothing in this little room, just a drain in the middle of the floor. It was probably put there to allow rainwater to drain away. There was something about the drain that bothered me. Whenever I saw it, I felt sick to my stomach. Once I even thought I saw the drain cover jiggle slightly when I opened the door. There always seemed to be a chill in the air whenever I opened the door to that little brick room. I only ever had the nerve to open the door in broad daylight, and then only to take a quick peek inside. Even though the sun was blazing outside, it was always deathly cold in the brick room. The memory of what happened in that room still haunts me and plagues my dreams from time to time. Shortly after I moved into the bedroom, I started having very bad dreams. One night I had a particularly horrifying nightmare, and I woke with the feeling that something was terribly, terribly wrong. Immediately, my eyes darted to the door. I lay there in bed, afraid to move, but unable to look away from the door in case there might be something there when I looked back. That was when I first heard the whispering noise. It sounded like a wire bush, softly rubbing against something. It wasn't coming from any discernible direction, but it seemed to gradually surround me like a blanket, pressing on my ears. Eventually, I managed to fall asleep, but the next morning I swore I could make out footprints in the dust around the drain in the little brick room. After that, the whispering rarely stopped at night. It was always there from time to time. I switched off the lights until I finally managed to sleep. Often I'd wake up in the middle of the night and find the room completely silent. Then, the whispering would start, as if it had been waiting until I was awake. Over the next months, the whispering continued. It was a hollow hish, shh, shh, ah, that seemed to repeat over and over. It didn't sound angry or sad. It was just always there. One night, something happened. I still have nightmares about this incident, and it makes me cringe and want to curl up in a ball whenever I recall it. I woke from a terrible nightmare. The moonlight was barely filtering in through the window. I looked at the door to the little brick room, and that's when I saw it. To my utter horror, I could make out something lurking in there. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw that it was a woman. She had dark curly hair and pale skin. Her eyes were completely black and filled with anger and hatred. Suddenly, she began shrieking and pounding on the glass door with both fists. Her head started swiveling around her neck, shaking back and forth like a kettle on the stick. Her hair tossed around violently and the skin around her mouth flapped loosely, giving me glimpses of her teeth and tongue. Saliva dripped from the corners of her mouth and flew off as she shrieked. I was terrified, and all I could do was let out a high-pitched scream. As I screamed, she shrank back from the door and slithered down the drain somehow. Her body was twisted and distorted, and I could swear I could hear her bones splintering and cracking as she wound herself back down the drain. My father came in charging down the hallway into my bedroom, thinking I was having a nightmare. When he got to the door, the drain lady was already gone. It was awful, and to this day, my father says he's never heard anyone scream so inhumanely before. I often ask him jokingly if he meant for me or her. The Orphaned House. One of my close friends lived next to a house that was always vacant. It would sell, people would move in, and then one day they'd be gone, and the house would be up for sale again. One summer, when the house was listed again and the last family had moved out, we decided to go take a tour and eat some Jack in the Box we'd picked up. We weren't very smart sometimes, and thought it would be cool to play chicken with whatever was haunting this house. My friend was really skinny, and so he crawled through the dog door that led straight into the kitchen, then opened the back door for me. We went through all of the rooms, and it was pretty nondescript. Just a typical 50s-style bungalow house with a similar layout to his home. Lots of pretty woodwork and built-ins. After we determined that the house wasn't really creepy after all, we sat down in the dining area, on the floor, across from a little horseshoe-shaped nook with a kitchen table and built-in bench. It was dusk out, but the windows didn't have curtains and it never got dark in our city anyway. At this point, we'd been sitting in the house for maybe 25 minutes, and after we finished eating, we stayed sitting just to hang out and talk, since we weren't really spooked out at all. All of a sudden, mid-sentence, completely out of nowhere, my vision went black, and I felt this eerie coldness wash over me. A feeling so thick, I felt like it penetrated through my body, down to my bones. At the very same moment this happened, my friend screamed. I visually could not see anything, and was groping around trying to find something to grab onto, and I felt so unsettled and cold. There's really no other word for it. After what felt like hours, I felt my friend's hand in mine, and he pulled me to my feet and dragged me through the house to the back door. He kept pulling on my arm, and I still couldn't see anything. We got outside slowly. You know that feeling when you get a whole body shiver and it runs down your spine? As soon as I was outside, that's what I felt. Except this was a whole body shiver that started at the tip of my toes and went all the way up to my scalp. And unexpectedly and suddenly, I could see again. My friend was as pale as a sheet, and I looked absolutely terrified. I felt off and sort of gross. I guess this is the best word, and in shock. I told him that I couldn't see until I was outside, and that it felt like I had been enveloped in blackness. He was just staring at me, and finally I asked him why he screamed. He hugged me and told me that he had pulled me out of the house as soon as I started reaching around like I was blind, because a little girl who was completely black and yet see-through crawled out from under the table we were across from and sat on top of me.